High voltage doesn't care about your deadlines. It doesn't care about your bonus, your pride, or how tough you think you are. It is a silent, invisible apex predator waiting for a single moment of human arrogance. Safety regulations in this industry aren't written in boardrooms. They're written in blood, burned copper, and ozone. And some men have to learn that the hard way. The Sector 4 substation sat on a desolate stretch of crushed gravel just off the interstate, a massive maze of steel structures, ceramic insulators, and thick aluminum cables. To the untrained eye, it looked like a gray, lifeless skeleton. To a lineman, it was a living, breathing beast. Even standing at the perimeter fence, you could hear it, a low, aggressive hum that vibrated right through the soles of your boots. That was the sound of 34,500 volts of electricity waiting for a path to the ground. I was 42 years old, and I'd been working the lines for 2 decades. I had all 10 fingers, all 10 toes, and a heart that beat in a steady rhythm because I treated that hum with absolute unflinching respect. It was a cold Tuesday morning, 72 hours before everything went wrong. The air was crisp enough that our breath plumed in front of us as we gathered around the tailgate of my utility truck. I was in the middle of my morning ritual, a process I never rushed. I held my Class 4 insulated rubber gloves up to my face, rolling the heavy black material tightly to trap the air inside, listening intently for the faintest hiss of a pinhole leak. A hole the size of a needlepoint was all it took for 34 kilovolts to find its way into your bloodstream. Once the rubber passed the test, I carefully slid them into their thick leather protectors. "You're treating those things like they're made of glass, James," a voice called out behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Oliver Cutler. Oliver was our site boss, a man who had spent more time climbing the corporate ladder than he ever had climbing a utility pole. His hard hat was pristine white, free of the scuffs and electrical burns that marked a veteran's gear. He carried a tablet instead of a tool belt, and he viewed safety protocols not as lifelines, but as frustrating obstacles to his schedule. "I'm treating them like they keep my heart beating, Oliver," I replied evenly, setting the heavy gloves down and moving on to inspect my grounding chains. Every link had to be solid. McIntyre leaned against the truck next to me, nursing a thermos of black coffee. Mac was in his early 30s, a solid, dependable worker who had a 3rd kid on the way and a mortgage that kept him awake at night. He looked tired. Next to him was Hudson, barely 22, green as spring grass and practically vibrating with nervous energy. Hudson looked up to Oliver's authoritative swagger, eager to please and desperate to secure his permanent union card. "We have a lot of ground to cover today, gentlemen," Oliver said, tapping the screen of his tablet with a clean fingernail. "The tie-in for the new residential grid needs to be prepped. The regional manager is breathing down my neck. We need to increase our pace." "Pace is dictated by protocol," I said, lifting a heavy coil of copper grounding cable over my shoulder. "We verify the line is dead. We isolate. We test. We ground. Then we work. Same as yesterday. Same as tomorrow." Oliver's jaw tightened, a brief flash of irritation crossing his perfectly groomed face. "Just make sure you're not holding up the young bloods, James. Some of us want to finish this job before winter sets in." He spun on his heel and marched toward the site trailer. I watched him go, feeling a familiar knot of tension forming in my gut. I turned to look at Mac. The younger man just offered a weary shrug. "He's got the heat on him from the top," Mac muttered, taking a sip of his coffee. "You know how it is." "I don't care how hot it gets in the office," I told him, my voice low. "The heat up on those towers is the only kind that matters. You double-check your dielectric boots today, Mac. And Hudson, you don't touch a single piece of aluminum until you see me place the grounds." "Understood." "Yes, sir," Hudson said quickly. I hoisted my gear. The air was cold, but the subtle, ominous hum of the substation felt heavier than usual. The pressure was building, and in this line of work, pressure always found the path of least resistance. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere on the site had shifted from standard workplace urgency to a suffocating, frantic push. We were huddled inside the cramped site trailer. The air smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and the dry heat rattling from the small space heater in the corner. Oliver stood at the front of the room, pointing a laser at a sprawling schematic of the Sector 4 grid pinned to the whiteboard. His sleeves were rolled up, and his voice carried a sharp, clipped edge that hadn't been there 2 days prior. "The schedule has been moved up," Oliver announced, panning his gaze across the crew. "Corporate wants the tie-in completed and energized by tomorrow evening." A heavy silence fell over the trailer. Even Hudson, who usually nodded along to everything Oliver said, looked confused. "Tomorrow evening?" Mac spoke up, shifting uncomfortably in his folding chair. Oliver, we still have to run the secondary isolations on the north bank. That's a full day of tagging and testing alone before we can even prep the physical splice. We are going to expedite the isolation process, Oliver said smoothly, waving away Mac's concern like a pesky fly. The main breaker at the upstream facility will be locked open. If the upstream is dead, the downstream is dead. We don't need to waste 6 hours applying redundant local grounds on every single tower in the North Bank. We ground the immediate work area and move. I sat up straight, the cheap plastic of my chair creaking loudly in the quiet room. That's a direct violation of standard lockout-tagout protocol, I said, my voice cutting through the stuffy air. You never trust an upstream breaker you can't physically see. Switches fail. Relays stick. Backfeed from a generator down the line can energize a dead circuit in a microsecond. We bracket ground every site we touch, period. Oliver's eyes narrowed. He planted his hands on the table, leaning toward me. James, I am the site supervisor. I have the clearance from the regional office to implement dynamic workflows to meet critical infrastructure deadlines. Are you questioning my authority? I'm questioning your physics, I replied without blinking. Authority doesn't stop an electrical current, grounding chains do. This isn't the 1990s anymore, Robinson, Oliver snapped. The new digital relays are fail-safe. If you want to spend half your shift climbing up and down attaching heavy chains like a dinosaur, fine. But Mac and Hudson have actual work to do. He turned his attention back to the younger men, his tone suddenly softening, taking on a manipulative conspiratorial warmth. Look, guys, Oliver said, leaning against the whiteboard. I'll be straight with you. There's a massive completion bonus attached to this contract. If we energize by tomorrow night, that bonus trickles down. Mac, I know you've got a baby coming. That's a nice chunk of change for a nursery. Hudson, you pulled us off. Your permanent placement is guaranteed. No more apprentice wages. But we can't get there if we're terrified of our own shadows. I looked at Mac. I saw the exhaustion in his posture, the heavy weight of his financial burdens pressing down on his shoulders. He looked down at his scarred work boots and swallowed hard. It's just the North Bank, Mac said quietly, almost to himself. If the main is open, we should be okay. Exactly, Oliver said, clapping his hands together briskly. Work smart, not hard. Let's get out there. As the crew filed out of the trailer, I grabbed Mac by the arm, pulling him back. Mac, don't let him buy your safety, I warned him, keeping my voice low. That bonus isn't worth your life. Mac offered a tired, strained smile. It's easy for you to say, James. Your house is paid off. My property taxes just went up 30%. I just need to get through tomorrow. He pulled his arm gently away and walked out into the cold morning. I stood in the doorway of the trailer, watching them head toward the trucks. Oliver had found their leverage. He had wrapped danger in the promise of security, and they were walking right into it. Friday morning arrived with a bitter, biting wind that whipped across the gravel lot. Today was the day of the tie-in. The tension on the site was palpable, thick enough to taste. We were parked beneath the massive steel lattice of Tower 42. Above us, the heavy aluminum lines hung against a flat gray sky. According to Oliver's tablet, the line was de-energized from the main station 3 miles away. I stood at the back of the utility truck, methodical as always. I had my heavy, thick rubber sleeves pulled up past my elbows, securing them before reaching for my Class 4 gloves. Next to me, on the tailgate, lay my hot, stick-along, insulated fiberglass pole, used to test voltage and manipulate live wires from a safe distance. I was thoroughly wiping it down with a silicone cloth. Even a thin layer of road dust or moisture could create a conductive path for electricity to travel right into my hands. Oliver walked over, holding a steaming cup of coffee in a branded insulated mug. He wasn't wearing a harness. He wasn't wearing rubber. He was dressed like he was going to a corporate retreat. He watched me wipe down the fiberglass pole for a long moment, a smirk playing on his lips. You know, James, Oliver said loudly, making sure Mac and Hudson could hear him from the other side of the truck. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were stalling. Are you planning on polishing that stick all day, or are we going to build a power grid? Hudson let out a short, nervous laugh. He was already geared up in his basic climbing harness, but I noticed immediately he had opted for his lightweight leather work gloves instead of his insulated rubber. Mac was similarly dressed down, prioritizing mobility over protection. I'm removing contaminants, I said calmly, not stopping my work. Dust conducts. The line is dead, James, Oliver said, rolling his eyes dramatically. I have the digital confirmation right here on the network. The breaker is open. There's zero load. You're out here suiting up like you're going to defuse a bomb. Look at you. You're weighed down with 40 pounds of grandpa gear. It's embarrassing. He turned to the younger men, gesturing toward me with his coffee cup. "This is what the old guard looks like, boys," Oliver mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. Terrified of progress, terrified of efficiency. He'd rather waste an hour wiping down a plastic stick than trust the million-dollar diagnostic software running this grid. "Safety isn't about trusting the software, Oliver," I said, finally turning to face him, letting the hot stick rest against the truck. "It's about knowing that when the software fails, the rubber doesn't." "Well, the rubber certainly slows you down," Oliver sneered. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes turning hard and authoritative. "Mac Hudson, you two get up in the bucket and start prepping the splice. James can stay down here and polish his tools until he feels brave enough to join the 21st century." Mac hesitated, looking at my heavy gear, then down at his own leather gloves. But Oliver stepped closer to the bucket truck, tapping his watch. "Clock is ticking, gentlemen," Oliver said, his voice dropping the playful mockery and adopting a sharp, threatening edge. "That bonus expires at sundown. Get in the air." Mac and Hudson climbed into the fiberglass bucket. I watched the hydraulic arm begin to lift them toward the gray sky, my stomach tying itself into a cold, heavy knot. The hydraulic whine of the bucket truck cut through the quiet morning air, lifting Mac and Hudson toward the gray sky. I watched the fiberglass basket rise, my eyes locked on the thick aluminum conductors hanging between the steel towers above them. The air felt wrong. The deep, vibrating hum of the substation behind us seemed to carry a heavier frequency. My instincts, honed over 2 decades of working inches away from invisible death, were screaming. I didn't think about my job. I didn't think about insubordination. I walked straight to the base of the bucket truck, reached past the chassis, and slammed my hand down on the large, red emergency override switch. The hydraulic engine choked out an abrupt hiss. The bucket jerked and ground to a sudden halt, bobbing violently 15 feet in the air. "What do you think you're doing, James?" Oliver roared, spilling hot coffee onto the gravel as he stormed toward me. His face was flushed crimson, the veins in his neck standing out against his crisp white collar. "Have you lost your mind? Bring the bucket down, Oliver," I said, my voice dangerously level. I did not take my hand off the override switch. Up in the basket, Mac peered over the fiberglass edge, looking down at us with wide, anxious eyes. Hudson was beside him, gripping the railing tightly. "You are officially trespassing on my site, Robinson," Oliver spat, stepping so close I could smell the peppermint of his toothpaste mixed with the dark roast coffee. "Release that switch right now." "They are going up." "I have not verified the isolation," I stated, staring directly into his eyes, refusing to give an inch of ground. "I have not placed a voltage tester on that line. I have not hung a single grounding chain. I do not care what your tablet says. Software fails. Human error happens. I need physical, visual proof of lockout, tagout from the upstream breaker, or I need a bracket ground this tower." "The line is dead," Oliver shouted, pointing violently upward. "The digital relay confirms 0 load. You are costing this company thousands of dollars by the minute because you're too stubborn to adapt. Now take your hand off my equipment." "No," I said simply. Oliver froze. He wasn't used to hearing that word. He was used to apprentices who nodded and veterans who grumbled but ultimately complied. "I am issuing a formal safety stand-down," I told him, making sure my voice carried up to the men in the bucket. "Under the occupational safety protocols for high-voltage transmission, I have the right to refuse work that presents an imminent threat to life. That line is not proven dead. Do not send them up there." Oliver's expression twisted into a cold, contemptuous sneer. He took a step back, pulling his radio from his belt. "You're not issuing a stand-down, James. You're fired," Oliver said, his voice dropping into a dark, authoritative register. "Clear out your locker in the trailer. Leave the company gear. You're off my site." He looked up at the bucket. "Mac," Oliver called out, "switch to upper basket controls. Override the base lock, take it up to the conductors, and prep the splice. We have a bonus to catch." Mac looked down at me. I saw the absolute agony of the decision tearing at him. I saw the flash of his unborn child, the mortgage, the crushing weight of modern life pressing against the heavy, invisible danger of the wire. "Mac, don't do it," I warned, my voice pleading, cracking the professional armor I usually wore. "Take the bucket down, please." Mac swallowed hard. He looked at Oliver's furious face, then down at his own leather-gloved hands. "I'm sorry, James," Mac whispered, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "I can't lose this job." Mac reached to the upper control panel. The hydraulic engine roared back to life. The bucket resumed its ascent, lifting them away from my reach, up toward the waiting aluminum. I stood on the gravel, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, entirely powerless as they rose into the gray sky. There is a sound that high voltage makes when it escapes its designated path. It is not a spark. It is not a zap. It is the sound of the atmosphere being ripped apart. I was walking backward, my eyes glued to the bucket as it positioned itself parallel to the three-phase lines. Mac leaned forward. Hudson was beside him, handing him a wire brush to clean the conductor before applying the splice. Neither of them wore insulated rubber. They were grounded to the bucket, and the bucket was grounded to the earth. I saw Mac reach out with his leather-clad left hand to stabilize himself against the nearest wire. The digital relay had lied. The upstream breaker had not held. The moment Mac's fingers made contact, 34,500 volts of electricity found a new path to the ground. It happened faster than the human brain could fully process. There was a sound like a shotgun blast going off inside a metal vault, a deafening, concussive crack that vibrated my teeth and my jaw. A sphere of blinding blue-white plasma erupted in the sky, hotter than the surface of the sun. The light was so intense it burned a permanent shadow into my retinas. A wave of superheated air slammed into the ground, knocking me backward into the side of the utility truck. Above, the fiberglass bucket violently shuddered. A thick cloud of vaporized copper and burnt insulation exploded outward, raining down like black snow. And then the most terrifying sound of all. Silence. The breaker had finally tripped, cutting the power, leaving nothing but the hiss of melting fiberglass, and the faint, sickening smell of ozone and roasted meat lingering in the freezing air. "Get out of the way!" I bellowed, scrambling up from the dirt and shoving past a paralyzed Oliver. Oliver was standing frozen, his tablet dropped on the crushed gravel, his pristine white hard hat knocked askew. His face was completely drained of color, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I vaulted onto the flatbed of the truck and dove for the emergency descent valve manual hydraulic bleed that didn't rely on the engine. I threw my entire body weight onto the lever. With a loud, agonizing hiss, the hydraulic pressure released and the bucket began to drop out of the sky in a rapid, jerky descent. "Call an ambulance," I screamed over my shoulder, not looking back. "Call them right now." The bucket hit its cradle on the back of the truck with a heavy thud. Smoke was pouring from the fiberglass edges. I scrambled up the side, not caring about the residual heat, and threw myself over the lip. Mac and Hudson were crumpled in the bottom of the basket. They were alive. They were both breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, their eyes wide and completely unseeing, pupils blown wide from the massive shock to their nervous systems. "Mac," I choked out, grabbing him by the shoulders of his fire-retardant jacket. "Mac, stay with me. Breathe." I looked down at his hands. There was very little blood. Electricity at that voltage cauterizes as it destroys. The heavy leather work gloves he had worn to prioritize efficiency were melted and fused to his skin. Where the leather had burned away, the flesh beneath wasn't just burned. It was completely blanched, a sickly, lifeless white. I moved to Hudson. He was whimpering a high, thin sound of pure, unadulterated terror. His hands looked identical. The current had traveled from the wire, through Mac, through the metal tools they were sharing, and through Hudson to find the ground. I had seen electrical burns before. I knew immediately what I was looking at. The entry and exit points were small, but the internal damage was catastrophic. The high-voltage current had traveled straight down the paths of least resistance, their nerves and their blood vessels. The neurological pathways in their arms were cooked. They were entirely fried. "Oh, God," Oliver whispered. I turned my head. He was standing on the bed of the truck now, staring over the lip of the bucket at the two men he had ordered into the sky. "Oh, God, James, what happened?" "You killed their hands," I said, my voice eerily calm, hollowed out by the sheer weight of the tragedy. "That's what happened, Oliver. You bought their hands for a bonus." In the distance, the faint wailing sound of sirens began to cut through the cold morning air. I stripped off my jacket, covering Mac's shivering body as deep shock set in, keeping my eyes fixed on the twisted, ruined hands that would never hold a lineman's tool or a newborn baby ever again. The smell of ozone and vaporized copper was replaced by the stinging scent of industrial bleach and sterile linoleum. The stark, buzzing fluorescent lights of the trauma center waiting room cast long, hollow shadows under the eyes of everyone sitting in the stiff plastic chairs. I had been sitting there for 9 hours. The dried mud on my work boots was flaking off onto the pristine floor. Emily, Mac's wife, sat 2 chairs down from me. She was 7 months pregnant. She hadn't cried since the first hour. Now, she just stared blankly at the wall, her hands resting protectively over her swollen stomach. Hudson's parents were in the corner holding each other in a terrified, trembling silence. No one from corporate had come. Oliver was conspicuously absent. It was just the families and me. Finally, the double doors of the surgical wing pushed open. A surgeon in blue scrubs walked out, pulling off his surgical cap. He looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from fighting a losing battle. We all stood up simultaneously. "Mrs. McIntyre?" "Mr. and Mrs. Miller?" the doctor asked softly. "Are they alive?" Emily asked, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper. "They are both stabilized," the surgeon nodded quickly, offering a tight, professional smile of reassurance. "The current bypassed their hearts. Structurally, their vitals are strong. They are going to live." A collective, shuddering breath left the room. Hudson's mother collapsed against her husband's shoulder, weeping softly. But I watched the surgeon's eyes. They hadn't softened. The hard part was still coming. "What about their hands, doctor?" I asked, my voice breaking the momentary relief. The surgeon looked at me, taking in my dirty work clothes, recognizing me as the one who brought them in. He sighed, a heavy deflation of his shoulders. "High-voltage electricity doesn't act like thermal fire," the doctor explained quietly, addressing Emily and the parrots. "It travels through the body's internal wiring, the nerves and the vascular system. We were able to restore blood flow. We did not have to amputate." Emily let out a small sob of relief, but the doctor held up a hand gently. "However," he continued, his tone turning incredibly gentle, yet devastatingly firm, "the neurological damage is catastrophic. The myelin sheaths surrounding the nerves in their forearms and hands have been completely destroyed by the heat of the current. The motor neurons are dead." The waiting room went dead silent. The buzzing of the overhead lights suddenly sounded like a roar. "What does that mean?" Hudson's father asked, his voice trembling. "For his future?" "It means they will keep their hands," the surgeon said softly, "but they will likely never have more than 5 to 10% motor function. They won't be able to grip. They won't be able to hold heavy objects. They will require years of occupational therapy just to manage basic daily tasks." Emily slowly sank back down into her plastic chair, her eyes wide and unseeing. He can't hold a tool," she whispered. "No, ma'am," the doctor replied. "Can he?" She looked down at her heavy stomach, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes, tracing tracks down her pale cheeks. "Will he be able to hold the baby?" The surgeon looked down at the floor. "He will be able to rest the child in his arms, but he won't be able to grip the child in his arms. But he won't be able to grip. I am so deeply sorry." I turned away, staring out the dark hospital window into the night. I saw my own reflection in the glass. The guilt hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I should have fought Oliver harder. I should have dragged Mac out of that bucket by his collar. Their careers were over. Their livelihoods were ashes. Because a man in a white hard hat wanted a completion bonus. A cold, hardened resolve began to freeze over the grief in my chest. Oliver Cutler had destroyed their lives. Now, I was going to dismantle his. 3 days later, the utility company officially suspended operations at the Sector 4 substation, pending a full internal and federal safety investigation. I was at my kitchen table, nursing a black coffee, staring at my personal logbook. The phone on the wall rang. It was the local union representative, a grizzled old-timer named Harris who had known me since I was an apprentice. "James, we have a problem," Harris said without preamble. His voice was grim. "I just got a copy of the preliminary incident report filed by Oliver Cutler to corporate and OSHA." "Tell me," I said, my grip tightening on my mug. "He's throwing Mac and Hudson under the bus," Harris growled. "The report claims that Cutler held a morning safety briefing expressly mandating Class 4 rubber gloves and sleeves for all bucket work. He claims the upstream breaker was visually verified and that the arc flash was caused by, quote, unauthorized operator circumvention of established safety protocols." A wave of absolute sickening disgust washed over me. He's blaming them. He's saying they chose not to wear the gear. "It gets worse," Harris continued. He filed digital logs showing that the secondary isolation orders were signed off on. He's painting a picture that Mac and Hudson went rogue, bypassed his direct orders, and caused the fault themselves. If this report holds, corporate won't pay out a dime of their medical or severance. They'll be fired per cause, James. They'll get nothing. Oliver was using the very system he abused to bury the men he broke. He knew the digital logs were entirely under his control on that tablet. He had retroactively altered the morning's workflow to cover his tracks. "He forgot one thing, Harris," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "What's that, James?" I reached across the table and rested my hand on my thick, leather-bound logbook, the grandpa gear Oliver had mocked so mercilessly. I don't trust digital logs, I said. I never have. When is the corporate deposition? Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. at the downtown headquarters. They're bringing in the heavy hitters, James. Lead counsel. Good, I said, opening my book to the pages dated that Friday. The ink was dark, the timestamps precise. I'll be there. The boardroom on the 40th floor of the utility company's headquarters was a world away from the crushed gravel and freezing wind of Sector 4. The table was expansive, polished mahogany. The chairs were plush leather. There was no hum of electricity here, only the muted, insulated quiet of corporate power. I sat on one side of the massive table, wearing a clean, pressed button-down shirt. Across from me sat Oliver Cutler. He wore a sharp, tailored suit, looking every bit the confident executive. He didn't look like a man whose hubris had just ruined 2 lives. He was mildly inconvenienced by the paperwork. At the head of the table sat Chloe Jenkins, the utility company's lead investigator and senior counsel. She was a woman in her late 50s, impeccably dressed, with eyes as cold and calculating as a circuit breaker. She commanded the room with absolute authority. Flanking her were 3 other executives, laptops open, faces grave. Mr. Cutler, Jenkins began, her voice crisp and professional. Your incident report indicates that the injured lineman flagrantly violated site protocol. You maintain that you explicitly ordered them to wear Class 4 insulation, and they refused. That is correct, Ms. Jenkins, Oliver said smoothly, clasping his hands on the table. I hold daily safety briefings. I cannot physically force grown men to put on their gloves once they are 50 feet in the air. It's a tragedy, truly, but it was operator error. Jenkins typed something on her laptop, not looking up. And the line was properly isolated, digitally verified, Oliver nodded, tapping his own tablet. The upstream breaker was logged as open. I have the network timestamps right here. As site supervisor, I acted strictly within standard operating procedure. Chloe Jenkins finally looked up, her piercing gaze shifting down the long table to me. Mr. Robinson, Jenkins said, you were the senior lineman on site. You were the only eyewitness. Your employment was formally terminated by Mr. Cutler approximately 4 minutes before the arc flash occurred. Do you contest his version of events? Every single word of it, I said, my voice steady, echoing loudly in the quiet room. Oliver let out a small, condescending sigh, rolling his eyes toward the executives. With all due respect, Ms. Jenkins, James is a disgruntled former employee. He is old school. He resents my management style and the modern efficiency metrics we use. Let Mr. 280 Robinson speak. Jenkins snapped sharply, cutting Oliver off instantly. She turned back to me. Proceed, James. I reached into my bag and pulled out my heavy leather-bound logbook. I placed it on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. Mr. Cutler relies on his tablet, I began, opening the book. A tablet that he has administrative access to. A tablet where timestamps can be altered after the fact. I rely on ink. I slid the open book down the table toward Jenkins. As senior lineman, it is my duty to maintain a physical, contemporaneous log of all site operations, I stated. If you look at the entry for 0800 hours on the day of the incident, you will see my notes from the safety briefing. Mr. Cutler explicitly mocked the use of plasfur gear, calling it, quote, grandpa gear. I have noted his direct refusal to allow me to bracket ground the tower. Oliver shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A handwritten notebook proves nothing. It's hearsay. Keep reading, Ms. Markey. Jenkins, I instructed, ignoring him entirely. At exactly 0814, I observed Mr. Cutler order McIntyre and Hudson into the bucket without proper PPE. I immediately approached the truck and engaged the manual hydraulic override. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, her eyes scanning my messy, precise handwriting. The bucket truck's internal black box will verify the exact millisecond the emergency override was engaged, I told the room. At 0815, I issued a formal, verbal safety stand-down, citing an unverified load and imminent danger. By federal regulation, work must immediately cease until the safety concern is investigated. The room grew incredibly tense. The executives stopped typing. Instead of investigating, I continued, my voice hardening into steel. Mr. Cutler terminated my employment on the spot and ordered McIntyre to bypass my lock using the upper basket controls. 3 minutes later, the line arched. Chloe Jenkins looked up from my logbook. She slowly closed it, her eyes shifting to Oliver. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Cutler, Jenkins said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet register. Did you fire your senior lineman for initiating a federally mandated safety stand-down? He was being insubordinate, Oliver stammered, the smooth confidence suddenly shattering. The color began to drain from his face. He was delaying the tie-in. We had a deadline. Did you or did you not verify the upstream isolation visually? Jenkins pressed, leaning forward. The digital relay failed. Jenkins slammed her hand down on the table, the sharp crack making Oliver flinch violently. You trusted a piece of software over the eyes of a 20-year veteran, and then you tried to alter the network logs to cover up your gross negligence. We have already pulled the server data from IT. We know you accessed the isolation logs 3 hours after the accident. Oliver's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on the deck of a boat. The trap had closed. His digital fortress had collapsed under the weight of an old man's ink pen. You didn't just cause an accident, Mr. Cutler, Jenkins said, her voice laced with absolute venom. You created a massive, indefensible legal liability for this corporation. You destroyed the lives of 2 of our workers to chase a bonus. Jenkins stood up, looking down at the broken man across the table. This deposition is over. The fallout was swift and brutal. The utility company did not wait for the federal investigators to finish their report. They brought the hammer down on Oliver Cutler with ruthless precision. He was fired for cause before he even reached the lobby of the corporate headquarters. They stripped him of his severance package, his pension, and his health benefits. But Chloe Jenkins wasn't finished. To insulate the company from the massive, impending OSHA fines and the inevitable lawsuits from Mack and Hudson's families, corporate legal took the unprecedented step of suing their own former site supervisor for gross negligence and fraud. Oliver's assets were frozen. His reputation in the industry was completely obliterated. He was facing personal bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for falsifying safety records. The arrogant man in the pristine white hard hat was systematically dismantled, left with nothing but the devastating consequences of his own hubris. Meanwhile, my logbook became the bedrock of Mack and Hudson's workers' compensation and personal injury claims. Corporate didn't even attempt to fight it. They settled immediately, offering full, lifetime medical coverage and substantial financial payouts to both men. It was a massive victory. It was the absolute destruction of the man who had hurt them. But as I sat on my porch a week later, looking out at the bare autumn trees, it didn't feel like a win. A settlement check couldn't change a diaper. A settlement check couldn't hold a wrench. I had won the war, but the casualties were irreversible. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke my thoughts. A sleek black corporate SUV pulled into my driveway. The driver's door opened and Chloe Jenkins stepped out. She looked out of place in my rural driveway, her sharp suit contrasting with the worn wood of my porch. I stood up, holding my coffee mug, watching her approach. "Mr. Robinson," Jenkins said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "Do you have a moment?" "You fired the man responsible, Miss Jenkins," I replied evenly. "You paid the families. We have nothing left to discuss." "We have a grid to discuss, James," she said, her tone all business. "May I come up?" I hesitated, then nodded toward the empty wooden chair opposite mine. She walked up the steps and sat down, carefully arranging her coat. She didn't offer small talk. "The Sector 4 substation has been locked down by OSHA since the incident," Jenkins began, looking directly at me. "Tomorrow they are lifting the hold. The residential tie-in still needs to be completed. Winter is coming, James. If that grid isn't energized before the first freeze, 3,000 homes go without reliable power." "Then send a crew," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "You have hundreds of linemen on payroll." "Corporate doesn't want another crew," Jenkins countered, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "The board is terrified. The PR fallout from this has been catastrophic. We cannot afford a single mistake on that site. We need someone who isn't afraid to stop a bucket. Someone who knows exactly how dangerous that substation is." She reached into her sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. She set it on the small table between us. "I'm not asking you to go back to work for Oliver's replacement," Jenkins said. "I am offering you the site. You will be the lead supervisor. You name your crew. You dictate the schedule. You write the safety protocols. Nobody above you can override your call on the ground." I stared at the folder. The irony was suffocating. I had been fired for trying to stop a tragedy, and now they were begging me to clean up the blood and finish the job. "And," Jenkins added softly, tapping the folder with one manicured finger, "there is a massive retainer attached to this contract. Enough to make sure you never have to climb a pole again once this job is done, if you don't want to." I looked away from the money. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused, scarred from 20 years of hard work, but they were whole. They functioned. I could grip the handle of a mug. I could feel the heat radiating through the ceramic. I thought about Mac, sitting in his living room, looking at his newborn baby and knowing he could never safely hold her. "I'll take the job," I said, my voice thick with a sorrow that the money would never touch. "On one condition." Jenkins nodded. "Name it. McIntyre and Hudson's settlement payouts aren't enough," I told her, my eyes hardening. "I want half of that retainer wired directly into a trust fund for their families, before I ever step foot on Sector 4. Chloe Jenkins didn't blink. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, a profound respect settling over her sharp features. "I'll have legal draft the paperwork this afternoon," she said quietly. 2 days later, I stood on the crushed gravel of Sector 4. The air was frigid, the sky a bruised, heavy purple. The massive steel skeleton of the substation loomed over me, but the ominous hum was gone. The entire grid was dead, walked out, and waiting. I was wearing my pristine white hard hat. It felt heavy. It felt wrong. Behind me, 4 veteran linemen men I had handpicked, men who had been in the trade as long as I had, were unloading gear from the utility trucks. There was no rushing. There was no talk of bonuses or corporate deadlines. The only sound was the clanking of heavy copper grounding chains and the rustle of thick Class 4 insulated rubber. I walked over to Tower 42. The ground beneath it was still scarred from the heat of the arc flash. The fiberglass bucket on the nearby truck was a melted, blackened ruin. It was a monument to Oliver's arrogance, left exactly as it had fallen. "Boss?" I turned. It was Harris, the old union rep. I had pulled him out of the office and back into the field to be my right hand on this job. He was holding a clipboard, a pen resting behind his ear. "The upstream breaker is physically locked open and tagged with my name," Harris reported, his voice low and respectful. "I've got eyes on the digital relay. It reads 0 load. "Don't trust it," I said, my voice carrying the weight of the men who weren't here. "I don't," Harris agreed instantly. "We're bracketing the entire north bank, grounding chains on every tower. We test every line before we touch it." "Good," I nodded. "Take your time, Harris. We do this right. We do it safe." I watched him walk away to join the crew. They moved with a slow, methodical reverence. Every piece of equipment was inspected. Every step was deliberate. They were treating the silent, gray beast of the substation with the absolute terror and respect it demanded. I looked up at the thick aluminum conductors hanging against the cold sky. I had the authority. I had the retainer. I had secured a future for Mac and Hudson that they couldn't provide for themselves anymore. But the victory felt hollow, echoing with the terrible sound of the blast that still haunted my nightmares. It took us 3 full days to complete the residential tie-in. 3 days of grueling, meticulous work in the freezing cold. We bracket grounded every tower. We wore 40 pounds of rubber and leather until our muscles ached and our joints screamed. We tested, we verified, and we tested again. On the evening of the 3rd day, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. I stood at the perimeter fence, holding the main radio. The site was clear. The splices were perfect. The grounds were removed. "Control, this is Sector 4. Lead," I said into the radio, my voice steady. "Tie-in is complete. Site is clear. You are clear to energize." "Copy that, Sector 4, the dispatcher replied over the static. Energizing in 3, 2, 1. A deep, powerful thrum suddenly vibrated through the ground beneath my boots. The giant ceramic insulators hummed to life. The invisible, silent predator was back, coursing through the aluminum veins of the towers, carrying heat and light to thousands of homes in the distance. The job was done. I walked back to my truck. The crew was already packed up, waiting to head home. I opened my heavy leather logbook and carefully wrote down the final timestamp. 1745. Grid energized. 0 casualties. I closed the book and rested both of my hands flat against the leather cover. I stared down at them. They were strong. They were calloused. They could feel the cold wind biting at my skin. I had fixed the grid. I had destroyed Oliver Cutler. I had ensured Mac and Hudson's families would never go hungry. But as I looked at my own 10 fingers, all I could feel was the profound, heavy guilt of a man who survived. I took off my white hard hat and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I didn't want to be the boss anymore. I didn't want the retainer. I just wanted my crew back, whole and unbroken. But high voltage doesn't give anything back. It only takes. And all you can do is make sure the next man respects the power enough to keep his hands